Hello, this is Chris Wilhelm, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the Friday, June 26th issue of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. We have a lot of federal court news today, so we'll start with this. Supreme Court rejects lawsuit alleging Roundup weed killer caused cancer. The court's decision is likely to determine the future of thousands of lawsuits against Bayer, which manufactures the weed killer, over similar claims. By Abby Van Sickle. The Supreme Court on Thursday sided with the manufacturer of the weed killer Roundup, overturning a jury award for a Missouri man who claimed the widely used herbicide caused cancer in a decision that could have sweeping impacts on thousands of other Americans who similarly claim the product sickened them. In a 7-2 decision written by Justice Brett M. Kavanaugh, the majority found that a federal law that regulates pesticides barred the Missouri man's lawsuit. Justice Kavanaugh wrote that the Missouri case would require a cancer warning on Roundup's label, which would directly conflict with the label required by the Federal Environmental Protection Agency. Because of this conflict, he wrote, federal law expressly preempts the Missouri man's claim. In an unusual pairing, Justices Ketanji Brown Jackson, a liberal, was joined by Neil M. Gorsuch, a conservative, in dissent. Justice Jackson wrote that in her view, the majority had misunderstood the scope of the federal law, leaving the Missouri man without a remedy for the significant harms he has suffered. The dispute focused on a single case, a $1.25 million award for John Durnell, a gardener in St. Louis, who had used Roundup for decades and claimed that years of exposure to the product led him to develop non-Hodgkin lymphoma, a blood cancer. Mr. Durnell claimed that the company had failed to warn customers of the dangers of the product. The ramifications of the decision could be enormous, potentially jeopardizing thousands of lawsuits pending in state and federal courts against Bayer, the German company that acquired Roundup's original maker, Monsanto, in 2018. The legal question before the justices focused on a narrow slice of the broader litigation, whether Bayer can be sued in state-level courts given that a federal agency decided not to issue a warning label for the weed killer. The Environmental Protection Agency, which is in charge of labeling pesticides throughout the country, has determined Roundup is safe. Bayer claims that the finding, which allows Roundup to be sold without a warning label, should override claims by Mr. Durnell and others that, under state laws, they were injured by the product. The Trump administration joined the case on Bayer's side, reversing the position taken by the Biden administration. The Trump administration's support for the Roundup manufacturer has been controversial among the Make America Healthy Again movement, whose activists had largely supported Mr. Trump's 2024 campaign for the White House. Zen Honeycutt, founder of Moms Across America and an advocate for the MAHA movement, on Thursday called the decision worse than treason and said it reflected a betrayal of President Trump's promises to the MAHA movement. It really is chemical warfare on the American people, she said. Vani Hari, a food activist and leading voice in the MAHA movement known as the Food Babe, said it's really sickening. She said that glyphosate, the active ingredient of Roundup, becomes now the midterm issue. Government lawyers asserted that once the EPA determined Roundup was safe, Bayer was in fact required to abide by the agency's decision in its product labeling. If the company had tried to unilaterally change the product's label, they argued, it would have violated the federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. Roundup, which was created by Monsanto in the 1970s, is one of the most popular weed killers in the world. But concerns over glyphosate, a chemical that is absorbed by plants, traveling into their roots and blocking an enzyme used for their growth, have prompted one of the biggest waves of class action lawsuits in U.S. history. Evidence in lab animals, along with more limited evidence in humans, has shown a link between glyphosate and cancer, and a 2015 report by the World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer classified it as probably carcinogenic to humans. The EPA has studied the chemical and determined a cancer warning was not necessary. In February 2020, the agency announced findings that there are no risks of concern to human health when glyphosate is used in accordance with its current label, and that the chemical was unlikely to cause cancer in humans. After a court challenge, the EPA withdrew those findings and said it would revisit and better explain its findings about the chemical's safety. In his lawsuit, Mr. Durnell said the company should be liable for failing to warn users about the risks of developing non-Hodgkin lymphoma from exposure to glyphosate. In 2023, a jury in the Circuit Court of the City of St. Louis, a state court, sided with Mr. Durnell. The company appealed the case, which eventually landed at the Supreme Court. Brian Leak, a spokesman for Bayer, said in a statement that the decision was good for science, farmers, and industries that depend on regulatory clarity for innovation. The decision by the justices drew sharp criticism, however, from both environmental advocacy groups and high-profile supporters of the Make America Healthy Again movement. Earth Justice, a nonprofit environmental law organization, released a statement calling the decision deeply troubling. Patty Goldman, a lawyer for the group, said that the ruling allows Monsanto and other chemical companies to avoid responsibility when their labels leave people unprotected from serious harm. Alex Clark, a leading voice in the MAHA movement and a supporter of Mr. Trump, posted on X, "For an administration that promised to take on corporate capture and make America healthy again, this is a stunning betrayal. Farmers, families, and cancer patients currently in litigation with Bayer will never forget this." Supreme Court expands Trump's power over immigration. The court handed President Trump victories in his push to rescind deportation protections for hundreds of thousands of people and turn away migrants at the southern border. By Anne E. Marimo. In a pair of sharply divided decisions on Thursday, the Supreme Court allowed President Trump's aggressive crackdown on immigration to move forward, permitting the administration to expel hundreds of thousands of migrants from the country and to turn away others at the southern border. Taken together, the opinions from the court's conservative majority signaled deference to the president's ability to set the nation's immigration policy as the justices prepare in the coming days to issue more rulings that will decide how much power to give Mr. Trump across his boundary-pushing agenda. In one ruling on Thursday, the justices allowed the Trump administration to end humanitarian protections that have permitted people from Haiti and Syria to live and work legally in the United States for more than a decade. Mr. Trump has long pushed to terminate the program, known as Temporary Protected Status, as part of his efforts to restrict immigration. The program was created by Congress with bipartisan support in 1990 to provide temporary legal status to people whose home countries were deemed unsafe because of war, natural disasters, or other crises. The court's 6-3 decision, divided along ideological lines, clears a path for the potential deportation of 350,000 Haitians and 6,100 Syrians, and it is likely to have implications for TPS holders from about a dozen other countries. The United States, which has a long history of political and military interventions in Haiti, initially extended TPS protections for Haitians in response to a 2010 earthquake that killed an estimated 220,000 people. People from Syria were included in TPS protections in the months after civil war broke out there in 2011. Both countries have faced violence and instability in the years since. In immigrant communities throughout the United States on Thursday, the ruling brought fear and uncertainty as people who were following the rules and living in the country legally contemplated a change in their status, potentially also affecting their ability to obtain work permits and driver's licenses. The ability of the government to quickly expel individuals who previously had protections will depend on whether they already have pending deportation orders. In many instances, TPS holders have not received such orders, which will allow some of them to contest their removal before an immigration judge. In a separate decision that also split 6-3, with the Liberals dissenting, the court on Thursday also said the Trump administration could turn away migrants seeking asylum along the U.S.-Mexico border by physically preventing them from crossing into the United States as they sought protection from persecution. The administration had asked the court to permit the government to revive the policy, first used in 2016. Under that so-called turn-back policy, the government had stopped asylum seekers from setting foot on U.S. soil, where federal law would have entitled them to try to claim asylum and receive protections. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who read a lengthy summary of her dissent from the bench on Thursday, said the court had endorsed the administration's decision to slam the door shut on all who are fleeing persecution, despite a system enacted by Congress to help people seek asylum in the United States. The opinions were delivered in the final days of the Supreme Court's term that began in October. On Monday, the justices are expected to announce another batch of decisions, and the president has been bracing for a likely defeat when the court rules on the legality of his effort to end the guarantee of birthright citizenship for the U.S.-born babies of illegal immigrants. Immigrant advocates denounced Thursday's rulings as major departures from the nation's long history of providing refuge to immigrants escaping persecution and unsafe conditions. Ahilan Arulanantham, a lawyer representing the Syrian migrants, said the court's decision had allowed the government to ignore a bedrock humanitarian protection that Congress, in bipartisan fashion, established 3 decades ago to ensure that vulnerable refugees would not be subject to partisan whims. Millions of people, he said, are at risk of being sent back to countries in crisis. The administration called the rulings a vindication of its efforts. The T in TPS stands for temporary, yet many of these designations became de facto amnesty. James Percival, the general counsel of the Department of Homeland Security, wrote on social media, "This is a win for the rule of law and common sense." In a majority decision allowing the president to strip deportation protections, Justice Samuel A. Alito Jr. said the federal law at issue prohibited courts from second-guessing an administration's determination. "This text is clear, and its plain meaning is very broad," he wrote. The court also rejected claims that the administration's decision was motivated by anti-Black and anti-Haitian prejudice that would violate constitutional prohibitions against discriminatory government actions. None of the statements the challengers cited by administration officials, including the president, was overtly racial, Justice Alito wrote on behalf of the court's 6 Republican-appointed justices. In substance, all expressed policy views that could rest on race-neutral justifications. The 3 liberal justices dissented, with Justice Elena Kagan quoting extensively from Mr. Trump's derogatory comments about Haitian immigrants. The statements fairly shout, in their racial undertones and overtones alike, that race entered into the president's resolve to remove Haitians from this country, she wrote. Since Mr. Trump returned to office last year, his administration has tried to end TPS for people from 13 out of 17 countries with the designation when President Joseph R. Biden Jr. left office. The administration has separately reshaped the refugee system, cutting the number of people allowed through the program from prior administrations and limiting it mostly to white South Africans. The changes have made it far more difficult for people who come from troubled or war-torn nations to find refuge in the United States. In response to Thursday's rulings, Stephen Miller, the top White House aide, said that the United States was fully closed to asylum seekers and that Haitian refugees who received temporary protected status should leave the country. For humanitarian protections, the Homeland Security Secretary determines when it should be available to migrants from any specific country, and the designation can last from 6 to 18 months. There is no limit on how many times a designation for a particular country can be extended. The law allows the Secretary to periodically review such protections, terminating or extending them for certain countries. But the law requires the Secretary to consult with relevant federal agencies, including the State Department, about conditions in a country, and then make a decision based on those assessments before initiating a change. The program had been repeatedly extended, becoming all but permanent for recipients from Haiti, Syria, and several other nations where crises have spanned many years. Last year, Kristi Noem, then the Homeland Security Secretary, moved to withdraw the protections from various countries. Both sides in the case before the court agreed that the law allows the administration to periodically remove countries from the TPS program, and that once terminated, beneficiaries lose legal protections and have to leave the United States. But immigrant rights advocates said Homeland Security Department officials failed to consult with other agencies about conditions in those countries as required by law. In its opinion on Thursday, the court acknowledged that the process the department followed included a terse and unspecific email, and that the department proceeded with the termination of protections for Syrians after receiving a laconic answer. But the majority said there was no role for courts to review the administration's determination, which it said encompassed both the final decision and the process leading up to that decision. Justice Kagan disagreed, saying that nothing in the statute would prevent courts from deciding whether the government had followed the proper procedures to reach a final determination. In this case, she said, no meaningful consultation had taken place between the agencies. They had no two-way communication about the right subject, she wrote. The court's decision had left most of those affected with no legal option except to leave the country, even at the price of leaving family behind. Otherwise, they will likely be detained or removed. The case reached the Supreme Court after class action lawsuits were filed by TPS holders, including engineers, students, doctors, and caregivers who want to continue to work and live in the United States because their lawyers say they could be killed if they were forced to return to Syria or Haiti. During oral arguments in April, the court's liberal justices pressed the administration's lawyer about whether the decision to end the program for Haitians was racially motivated. The justices cited the president's false accusations during the 2024 campaign that Haitians in Springfield, Ohio, ate their neighbors' pets, and Mr. Trump's comments in December about Haitian immigrants being undesirable because they come from a filthy, dirty, disgusting country. D. John Sauer, the Solicitor General, said those statements were unilluminating and were references to poverty and crime rather than race. The text of the statute prohibits judicial review of any determination of the executive branch with respect to the designation or termination or extension of a designation. Lower court judges, however, sided with the Haitians and Syrians, finding that the Homeland Security Secretary's process was subject to court review and that her decisions had been preordained and not based on meaningful analysis. The judges postponed the terminations, prompting the government's lawyers to ask the Supreme Court to intervene. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Supreme Court overturns Hawaii gun law. The case involved a Second Amendment challenge to a Hawaii law that barred carrying concealed weapons without permission onto private property open to the public, by Abby Van Sickle. The Supreme Court on Thursday struck down a Hawaii law that required gun owners to get permission before carrying a concealed firearm onto private property like grocery stores, coffee shops, and gas stations that are otherwise open to the public. The case is the latest victory for gun rights advocates before the court since the justices decided in the 2022 landmark Second Amendment ruling in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin that Americans have a broad right to arm themselves in public. In a 6-3 decision split along ideological lines, the court's conservative majority held that Hawaii's gun restriction violated the Second Amendment protections. Writing for the majority, Justice Samuel A. Alito, Jr. said that Hawaii's law violates the constitutional right to keep and bear arms because it hobbles what the Second Amendment protects, the right of Americans to carry arms for self-defense as they go about their daily lives. The court's 3 liberal justices dissented. In her dissent, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, joined by Justice Sonia Sotomayor, wrote that states could protect private property rights by requiring those wishing to carry guns into private property to get express consent from the property owner before doing so. She added that in her view, the majority's objective was protecting guns, not consistently preserving any principle of law. The decision is the second time in recent weeks that the justices have sided with gun owners who argued that laws restricting firearms violated the Second Amendment. On June 18th, the justices voted unanimously in favor of a Texas marijuana user who argued that gun owners should not be automatically stripped of their rights because of illegal drug use. In the Bruen case, the court's conservative majority laid out a new test for gun control laws, finding that courts should analyze whether they align with the country's history and tradition to determine if they met constitutional muster. In response to that ruling, lawmakers in Hawaii revisited state gun laws, quickly passing a number of new restrictions on concealed carrying of handguns. Among them was a ban on weapons in so-called sensitive places such as schools, parks, and beaches. That law also required people to get explicit permission from owners before carrying weapons onto private property otherwise open to the public. It was that portion of the state's law at issue before the Supreme Court. A group of individual gun owners in Maui, along with a gun rights organization, sued in 2023 to challenge the law, asserting it violated the Second Amendment. During oral arguments in January in the case, Wolford v. Lopez, the justices wrangled over how they should apply the Bruen test and how to balance its focus on the country's history of gun rights with the nation's tradition of upholding robust private property rights. The Trump administration supported the challenge to the gun law. During the argument, Sarah M. Harris, a principal deputy solicitor general, argued that Hawaii's law would gut Bruen by preventing everyone licensed to carry from doing so at retail establishments or other private property open to the public absent the owner's express consent. Lawyers defending Hawaii's law asserted that the gun law met the Bruen test and that it flowed from the history and tradition of both the islands and the rest of the country. The state has long had some of the nation's tightest gun regulations and is known for rarely granting concealed carry permits. State officials pointed to Hawaii's traditions as a kingdom, including an 1833 law in place during the reign of King Kamehameha III that prohibited any person or persons from possessing deadly weapons. But in Thursday's decision, Justice Alito wrote that the majority found the historical examples cited by Hawaii in support of its law unconvincing and vastly different from Hawaii's gun restriction. In dissent, Justice Jackson countered that Hawaii had demonstrated a history and tradition of tight gun restrictions. During oral arguments, justices had tangled over some of the historical evidence introduced by Hawaii's lawyers. That included an 1865 Louisiana law that had outlawed carrying guns onto plantations or lands without the owner's permission, which Hawaii's lawyers argued showed that the island state's law had a historical precedent from the mainland as well. The gun rights activists said the Louisiana law was one of the so-called Black Codes, a series of laws passed by southern states in a post-Civil War effort to limit the carrying of firearms by formerly enslaved people. While part of the nation's history, they argued, it was not a statute that should be emulated in the modern day. Is it not the height of irony to cite a law that was enacted for exactly the purpose of preventing someone from exercising the Second Amendment right, to cite this as an example of what the Second Amendment protects? Justice Alito asked a lawyer for Hawaii. Justice Jackson, one of the Supreme Court's 3 liberals and the first black woman to sit on the court, countered that the Black Codes, too, are part of the country's history and traditions. The debate, she said, highlighted flaws in the court's new Bruen test. To the extent that we have a test that relates to historical regulation, but all of the history of regulation is not taken into account, I think there might be something wrong with the test, she said. Alan A. Beck, the lawyer who represented the Hawaii gun owners who challenged the law, said on Thursday that he and his clients were pleased with the outcome. The ability to carry guns is a pretty new thing in Hawaii, he said. There's a growing population of people who are exercising their Second Amendment right to carry, and this opinion allows them to do that. He added that Hawaii has long had some of the most restrictive gun laws in the country, and that the opinion would give people in Hawaii the same rights that everyone in the rest of the country has. Everytown for Gun Safety, a nonprofit advocacy group founded by Michael R. Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York, released a statement calling the ruling disappointing. Janet Carter, who directs Second Amendment litigation for Everytown Law, the group's legal arm, said in a statement that the court cannot take away a private property owner's authority over their own land, and that business owners could take small steps to make clear guns aren't welcome, as simple as posting a sign at the door. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And we have one more court article. Federal judge strikes key parts of Trump order restricting mail voting. The ruling rejected the Trump administration's attempt to change federal election procedures through an executive order. By Nick Corasaniti and Adam Sella. A federal court in Massachusetts struck down crucial components of an executive order from President Trump that sought to place significant restrictions on mail voting as unlawful, null, and void. The order had, in part, tried to use federal oversight of the U.S. Postal Service to regulate mail voting. The ruling from Judge Indira Talwani amounted to a broad rejection of the Trump administration's attempts to change federal election procedures through an executive order, repeatedly emphasizing that the Constitution grants authority over elections not to the executive branch, but to individual states and Congress. The Constitution does not grant the president any specific powers over elections, Judge Talwani wrote, adding emphasis by underlining the words does not. More than 20 Democratic attorneys general representing states across the country brought the legal challenge in federal court in Massachusetts. Mr. Trump's executive order, signed in March, called on the Department of Homeland Security to compile state-by-state citizen lists to help determine voter eligibility. It called on the Postal Service to verify voters based on lists provided by states. Earlier this month, the Postal Service complied with the order, releasing a proposed rule consistent with many of Mr. Trump's demands. The decision comes as Mr. Trump has renewed his push to pass federal legislation that would impose fresh voting restrictions, canceling the signing of a celebrated bipartisan housing measure on Wednesday, and instead demanding that Republicans first pass the president's priority voting legislation known as the Save America Act. A spokesperson for the Postal Service did not immediately respond to requests for comment. Abigail Jackson, a spokeswoman for the White House, defended the executive order's legality and said that the administration was confident that we will ultimately prevail in putting in effect the executive order. She reiterated the administration's intent to pass the Save America Act in Congress. President Trump is committed to ensuring that Americans have full confidence in the administration of our elections, Ms. Jackson said. Multiple lawsuits have challenged the executive order, including a separate case in Washington, D.C., where a judge initially decided not to block the order after concluding that, because it had not yet been carried out, no state or party had suffered legal harm. Judge Talwani, however, found that the executive order had already forced many states that were part of the Massachusetts lawsuit to change election policies and procedures. Connecticut had already shifted election workers away from other duties to begin planning for the executive order, and nearly half the states were grappling with the fact that they had already purchased mail ballot envelopes that were not in compliance with the directive. Not only are plaintiff states experiencing injury now with respect to planning, but it is undisputed that should the EO's directives go into effect, plaintiff states will incur compliance costs, Judge Talwani, who was appointed by former President Barack Obama, wrote. The ruling focused on two sections of the executive order that sought to create state-by-state citizenship lists within the Department of Homeland Security and direct the Postal Service to use an approved list of voters to guide election mail. Judge Talwani found that the authority to create voter lists and to determine voter eligibility rests with the states, writing that the Constitution reserves the power to determine voter eligibility to the states alone. But she also questioned whether records that the government would be relying on would be able to track name changes, such as when a woman changes her name at marriage, or residence changes when citizens move from state to state. It is clear that the federal agencies charged with compiling confirmed citizen lists lack the ability to create complete and accurate lists of the U.S. citizens residing in every state, Judge Talwani wrote. And the judge returned to the question of executive authority, finding that the president lacks any authority to compile voter lists for each state. Similarly, regarding the provision directing the Postal Service to take a more direct role in overseeing mail voting, Judge Talwani found the agency lacked authority over elections. No law enacted by Congress delegates authority to control mail-in voting to USPS, Judge Talwani wrote, adding that the service lacks statutory authorization to promulgate any binding regulations on mail-in voting. The judge's ruling comes a day after Postmaster General David Steiner confirmed in a hearing before the Senate that a proposed rule would block mail ballots in states that do not hand over sensitive voter data to the federal government. Mr. Steiner has repeatedly said that the Postal Service would follow court orders. In an interview with the New York Times earlier this year, he said that he would defer to the courts on the legality of Mr. Trump's executive order and reaffirmed that the service would absolutely continue to deliver mail-in ballots. Apple raises prices on Macs and iPads amid the AI boom. The tech giant cited the soaring costs of memory and storage chips as it increased prices more than $200 on some devices. By Callie Huang. Apple raised the prices of its Macs and iPads on Thursday, citing the soaring costs of memory and storage chips as the artificial intelligence boom has created a frenzy for the components. Apple increased prices on some laptop and tablet models $200 or more. A base model of the MacBook Pro, for example, now costs $1,999, up from $1,699. The increases show that even Apple, with its sprawling supply chain, is not immune to a global shortage in memory and storage chips. AI chip makers like NVIDIA and Advanced Micro Devices have demanded more of the components for their own chips, which are then used in data centers for developing and running AI systems. The surge in demand has led memory chip manufacturers like Micron to focus on producing for data centers, which tend to use the more expensive chips than consumer electronics. As a result, those companies are making more money but shipping fewer consumer-grade chips, which have become more expensive. Memory and storage chip prices have quadrupled over the past year, according to analyst estimates, and the cost of those components is expected to continue to rise. Those costs are now being passed on to consumers. Microsoft raised prices for its Surface laptops in April. We have never seen a component price increase this much, this quickly, a spokesman for Apple said in a statement. We have now reached the point where we need to begin raising prices. Apple's share price fell as much as 6% on Thursday. Apple's chief executive, Tim Cook, said during an investor call in April that the company expected significantly higher memory costs for the quarter, which runs through June. Beyond the June quarter, we believe memory costs will drive an increasing impact on our business, Mr. Cook said on the call. The company also said it expected its profit margins to decline slightly for the quarter. Apple also raised the prices of its HomePod speaker and Vision Pro mixed reality headset on Thursday. The timing of the price increases was unusual. Apple typically raises prices when it releases new or refreshed products. In September, Apple released new iPhones and raised the prices for some models $100. Hoping for miracles as Venezuela digs out from massive quakes. It is known as a doublet, 2 earthquakes in quick succession, and it has brought the Latin American country to its knees. By Maria Victoria Fermin, Anatoly Kurmanev, Julie Turkowitz, Isayan Herrera, and Michael Levinson. Rescue workers and desperate residents dug for survivors in the rubble of large apartment buildings and flattened homes on Thursday after back-to-back major earthquakes struck Venezuela, a country already reeling from decades of economic and political upheaval. The Venezuelan government said that at least 235 people had been killed and more than 4,300 injured in the 2 quakes. The first, with a magnitude of 7.2, struck west of the capital, Caracas, on Wednesday, just after 6 p.m. local time. It was followed by another, much stronger one, measuring 7.5, just 39 seconds later. The rare 1-2 punch, known as a doublet, was one of the most powerful tectonic events to strike Venezuela in the past century, and the death toll was virtually certain to rise as rescuers began to reach hard-hit areas and remote hillside towns. La Guaira, a port city north of Caracas, appeared to have taken one of the heaviest blows. Entire buildings there had crumbled to the ground. Some apartments had only walls remaining, making them look skeletal. When Yorliana Colmenares stood near one building that had been reduced to rubble, she heard tapping noises on Thursday morning. Her boyfriend was trapped inside, she believed, but no rescue workers, firefighters, or medical workers had arrived, so residents were digging by themselves through crushed walls and knotted wire and dust. "They've pulled out a lot of dead people," Ms. Colmenares said. "Injured people, children, animals." Outside another building, a couple searched for their 8-year-old son. He was playing basketball when the quake hit and had not been seen since. The disaster came at a critical moment for Venezuela. Less than 6 months ago, U.S. forces captured the country's autocratic leader, Nicolas Maduro, and took him to New York to face drug trafficking charges. Mr. Maduro's removal transformed Venezuela from a U.S. adversary into what is effectively a satellite state led by his former vice president, Delcy Rodriguez. She has been backed by the Trump administration and has been facing popular discontent. Since it arrested Mr. Maduro, the Trump administration has demanded that Venezuela open its oil sector to foreign companies, especially those from the United States, work with U.S. security and intelligence services, cut ties with American adversaries, and free political prisoners. The earthquakes and the long road to reconstruction ahead will test how much the Trump administration is now willing to support Venezuela as it continues to turn the country into an economic protectorate. Ms. Rodriguez said in a televised address on Wednesday evening that the quakes had caused widespread damage, especially in Caracas and La Guaira. She said that there had been power outages in both Caracas and La Guaira, though the electricity grid continued to function in the rest of the country. Dozens of buildings have collapsed, and right now we are in very arduous rescue operations, Ms. Rodriguez said. She called it a true tragedy. The U.S. Geological Survey said that many people in the quake-affected region live in vulnerable structures made of brick and adobe. Similar weaknesses existed in 1967, when an earthquake in Caracas killed hundreds of people, and officials attributed the deaths to faulty construction. Venezuela sits on the edge of the South American tectonic plate, where it abuts the Caribbean plate, and earthquakes commonly strike on or near such boundaries. But the 7.5 magnitude quake on Wednesday was the largest to hit the country since October 29, 1900, when a 7.7 magnitude earthquake was recorded near the country's coast. Residents described shock and confusion as the violent shaking leveled homes, rattled windows, and knocked out power. "I felt the most terrified I have ever felt in my entire life," said Luisa Martinez, 68, who lives in Valencia, Venezuela's third largest city, about 100 miles west of Caracas. The noise, the windows slamming open and shut, and everything creaking like never before, it was horrifying. My husband, my son, and I hugged each other and started to pray, crying out to God to save us. Officials shut off gas supplies in the affected area, and water service was disrupted in parts of Caracas and several northern states, including Miranda, Falcón, Yaracuy, Zulia, and La Guaira, Ms. Rodriguez said. Subway and rail services were suspended, and the Simón Bolívar International Airport, which serves the capital, was closed after it sustained heavy damage. Ms. Rodriguez said schools would be closed for the rest of the week. Early Thursday, no lights were on in parts of Caracas, especially in the west of the city, and streets were flooded from burst water pipes. In La Guaira, more than 100 buildings had collapsed, according to the United Nations' main humanitarian agency. Residents there said they needed heavy machinery that could move rubble and were frustrated that only civilian rescue workers in flimsy helmets had arrived. "My sister lived here," cried one woman who stood by a damaged apartment building as workers scraped away rubble. "I see no one here. This is the government's neglect." Angie Reyes said that she was desperate to find a co-worker, Daniel Vivas, 43, who lived in a sixth-floor apartment in La Guaira. She said she feared that no one would reach him in time. "We're stuck like this until the international community arrives," Ms. Reyes said. La Guaira is no stranger to disaster. In 1999, mudslides there led to at least 15,000 deaths. They occurred just months after a divisive new government took power, becoming the first major crisis for President Hugo Chavez, Mr. Maduro's predecessor. In her televised address on Wednesday night, Ms. Rodriguez stood next to the Interior Minister, Diosdado Cabello, whom the Trump administration accused of narco-terrorism in the same indictment that it secured against Mr. Maduro. "I ask that we act in national unity, with calm, and that we know that together we are going to overcome this tragedy," she said. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said on Thursday that he had spoken to Ms. Rodriguez and that the United States was deploying search and rescue teams from Fairfax County, Virginia, and Los Angeles. Speaking to reporters while traveling in Bahrain, Mr. Rubio said that other teams would follow and that the United States was also providing Venezuela with overhead imagery of hard-hit areas. He said that the Defense Department would coordinate aid flights because of damage to the main airport in Caracas. "No matter what, the United States has always responded to humanitarian crisis, especially in our own hemisphere," Mr. Rubio said. "That's what we're focused on now." Many other countries also promised to help, including China and India, as well as Latin American nations like Chile, Argentina, Colombia, Panama, Brazil, and El Salvador. Venezuela is rich in oil, but still trying to emerge from a decade-long depression that wiped out most of its economic production and prompted millions to leave the country. Its rescue services have been hollowed out, infrastructure has been left to rot, and inflation has reached record highs. Those problems will likely compound the challenges of recovery. On Thursday, workers used heavy machinery to lift large chunks of rubble from a flattened 6-story building in the El Paraíso neighborhood of Caracas, hoping to find 7 residents who had been reported missing. Vladimir Navas stood nearby looking for his in-laws, Freddy Carrero, 86, and Eliana Hernandez, 82. He believed they were home watching a World Cup game when the quakes struck. "There's no possibility that they got out," Mr. Navas said. "You can't hear anything. If anyone is alive in there, it's a miracle." You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Iran strikes ship in Strait of Hormuz, undermining efforts to restore traffic. The attack, confirmed by U.S. and Iranian officials, came after Tehran threatened to disrupt shipping in the waterway and as Washington sought regional support for its peace agreement. By Peter Eavis, Farnaz Fasihi, Jenny Gross, and Ewan Ward. Iran's armed forces struck a container ship that was passing through the Strait of Hormuz on Thursday, according to U.S. and Iranian officials, undermining efforts to restore shipping traffic through the crucial waterway. The attack came hours after Iran, demonstrating its hold over the strait, had warned ships that the only route through the vital pathway for oil and natural gas was through its waters. Many ships had been using a route on the southern side of the strait, hugging the Omani coast. The strike halted traffic through the crucial waterway, contradicting President Trump's claim that Iran did not control the strait and his assurances that it was open once again to shipping. Oil prices jumped after the attack, with the cost of Brent crude, the global benchmark for oil, rising over 2% to about $75 a barrel. West Texas Intermediate crude, the U.S. benchmark, also rose over 2% to around $72 a barrel. A U.S. official who spoke anonymously in order to share details of the strike said the vessel had been hit by a drone. The attack prompted the International Maritime Organization, a United Nations agency, to suspend its plan to evacuate seafarers from hundreds of ships that had been stranded in the Persian Gulf. It was not clear how the strike would affect ongoing negotiations between the United States and Iran over control of the strait and over Iran's nuclear program. Secretary of State Marco Rubio met on Thursday with Gulf Arab leaders in Bahrain to try to allay their security concerns. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had warned ships earlier on Thursday that they must coordinate with its navy and that they should not take an alternative route, in an apparent reference to Omani territorial waters. The threats came just as shipping in the waterway was surging this week after months of near paralysis. This route is unacceptable and extremely dangerous, the Revolutionary Guard's Navy said early on Thursday in a statement carried by Tasmin, an Iranian news agency tied to the Guards. We warn all vessels to strictly refrain from any movement outside the designated routes, it added, warning that action would be taken against vessels that did not heed its instructions. The United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operations Organization, which is administered by Britain's Royal Navy, reported that a cargo vessel had been hit by an unknown projectile, damaging the bridge. The episode happened 7.5 nautical miles southeast of Dahit, Oman, where vessels were transiting. The ship struck, the Ever Lovely, was owned by Evergreen Marine, a shipping company based in Taiwan, according to Equisys, a ship database. Arsenio Dominguez, Secretary General of the International Maritime Organization, did not name the attacked ship in a news release on Thursday, but said it had not been part of the agency's evacuation operation. The Wall Street Journal initially reported the strike on the vessel in the strait. Jacob Larson, the chief security officer at BIMCO, the world's largest shipping association, said in a statement on Thursday that the attack underscored the importance of having clear agreements between the United States and Iran on the resumption of shipping through the strait. The current agreement is not sufficiently clear, he said. The Iranian official, who asked not to be named because he was not authorized to speak publicly, said Oman's providing an alternative route to vessels for transiting the strait has angered Iran and undermined its control over the passageway. Therefore, it decided not to act. The official said Oman was in a difficult position, working with Iran to create a management system over the strait and under pressure from the United States to reject all monetization and open the waterway. He added that Oman did not have the ability to provide security guarantees to vessels without Iran on board, and that Iran, which was insisting on maintaining its control over the area, would not tolerate a second or third-party intervention. Though Iran agreed last week to let vessels pass through the strait safely, it is also seeking to gain more influence over shipping traffic in the waterway, said an analyst, Noam Raidan, a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Iran wants this navigational order to be in according to its own terms, she said. Traffic through the strait, an energy route that Iran and the United States blockaded during the war, had jumped this week as vessels stranded for months in the Persian Gulf began leaving. Shipping companies are seeking to take advantage of a temporary 2-month window to move Middle East crude oil. About 70 vessels transited the waterway on Wednesday, including 29 tankers, making it the busiest day since March 1st, according to figures offered on Thursday by Kepler, a marine data company. Before the war, 130 or more ships passed through the strait every day. Bahrain is the final stop of a 3-country tour for Mr. Rubio, which also took him to the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait. At a meeting with representatives of the 6-member Gulf Cooperation Council in the Bahrain capital, he sought to assuage concerns among regional allies over a framework peace agreement with Iran that had left some of their central security questions unaddressed. We want to ensure that any decisions that are made throughout this negotiating process, the interests of our partners and our allies in the region are always taken into account, Mr. Rubio told the Council's representatives on Thursday. The deal should not undermine the security, the stability, or the prosperity of any of our partners in the Gulf region, he added. Gulf Arab states have broadly welcomed efforts to end the war, but remain uneasy about provisions of the preliminary agreement. The deal does not address Iran's missile and drone programs, which Tehran used to attack Gulf countries, some hosting American military bases, after the conflict with the United States and Israel began in late February. The crucial question of how shipping will be managed through the Strait of Hormuz also remains unresolved. The naval arm of the Revolutionary Guards, in its latest threat, repeated that coordination with the Guards was mandatory for vessels seeking to transit the strait. Iran has insisted on this since the framework U.S.-Iran peace deal was announced last week. Several container ships, some of which were stranded for more than 3 months, have been able to leave the Persian Gulf. The Danish shipping giant Maersk said 2 of its vessels left the Gulf between late Wednesday and early Thursday after security assessments and consultations with regional security partners. 3 Maersk vessels remain in the Gulf and are expected to leave later, the company said. Since early May, the U.S. military has helped ships sail through the strait on routes close to Oman. More than 500 ships and 250 million barrels of crude have been moved under that effort, according to U.S. Central Command, which is behind the operation. Mr. Rubio, during his meeting with Gulf Cooperation Council foreign ministers on Thursday, rejected Iran's continued claim to control passage through the strait. The international waterways do not belong to any nation-state, he said. This is a foundational principle in the world today, without which the world would be in total chaos. And finally today, King Charles III has paid more than $39.6 million in taxes, Palace discloses in a UK first. Charles released his tax information for the period he has been King of Britain as part of a push for greater transparency after scandal involving the former Prince Andrew. By Megan Specia. King Charles III released details of his personal income taxes on Thursday, becoming the first British monarch to do so amid public demands for more transparency from the royal family. Since ascending to the throne, the king has paid more than £30 million, around $39.5 million, in taxes, Buckingham Palace confirmed in an annual briefing on royal finances. The palace also revealed that King Charles and Queen Camilla will not make Buckingham Palace, long the official London residence of the monarchy, their home once a decade-long refurbishment project is completed there next year. Thursday's statement on the financial assessment includes a look at the sovereign grant, the public money that pays for the monarch's official duties and the royal palaces. For centuries, net profits from the Crown Estate, the huge collection of land and offshore assets in the United Kingdom that belongs to the reigning monarch, has been passed to the government in return for a fixed yearly payment to finance the royal family and its duties. Since 2012, this payment has taken the form of the sovereign grant, which is calculated as a percentage of the estate's profits. The sovereign grant for the year from 2025 to 2026 rose £132.1 million, or around $174 million, benchmarked against the revenue of the Crown Estate. Over half of the grant, some £67.5 million, was allocated to preserving and protecting the occupied royal palaces, the palace said. Charles previously released details of the taxes he paid while he was the Prince of Wales, but this is the first time that a sitting British monarch has revealed the taxes he or she paid on personal income. Anti-monarchy campaigners, lawmakers, and members of the public have long called for more transparency from the royal family over its financial arrangements. That pressure has intensified since a scandal involving King Charles' younger brother, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, and his friendship with the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. The official duties of the king and other working royals are funded through the sovereign grant. But when Charles succeeded his mother to the throne upon her death in 2022, he inherited a large, undisclosed personal fortune that added to the immense wealth he had already accumulated. In 2023, the Treasury published a document detailing how the king would pay his taxes, which he does on a voluntary basis, as laws on how taxes are paid do not apply to the sovereign. The king pays income, capital gains tax, and inheritance tax, the agreement shows. His private sources of income, like investments and trading profits, are taxed. He also pays taxes on the privy purse, independent funds used to cover official duties that are not financed by taxpayers, and the ruler's personal, living, and private expenses. Most of the privy purse funding comes from earnings from the Duchy of Lancaster, a large land estate held by the reigning monarch and passed down through generations. Queen Elizabeth II was the first British monarch to pay taxes, and she began doing so only in 1992. At the time, the New York Times described the decision as a well-timed public relations initiative to diffuse festering resentment over the royal wealth and lifestyle among Britain's recession-weary public. The announcement on Thursday comes at another fraught moment for British royals, with increasing public scrutiny about their wealth. Public polling suggests that while most British residents, 55%, support the monarchy, that number is the lowest it's been in 3 decades. After the details of the king's personal taxes were published, the anti-monarchy group Republic issued a statement criticizing the palace for not disclosing his total income. Another hike for Charles, more spin and gloss, and more misdirection on taxes. Graham Smith, the chief executive of Republic, wrote, "This is the way with royal reporting. The more they reveal, the more questions are raised." Prince William, the king's son and first in line to the throne, also released tax details in a separate briefing, reporting that since becoming the Prince of Wales in September 2022, he has paid more than £20 million, or $26.4 million. The reconstruction project at Buckingham Palace was intended to modernize essential building services. The palace has been considered the principal official residence of the British sovereign since Queen Victoria's ascension in 1837. King Charles' official London residence has remained nearby Clarence House, where he has lived since 2003, even after he became the monarch, because of the work taking place at Buckingham Palace. His Majesty retains huge affection for Buckingham Palace and a deep respect for its role in royal and public life, a palace spokesperson said. It will remain a working home, but we are seeking to widen public access precisely to maximize the national benefit of a publicly funded building. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the Friday, June 26th issue of the New York Times. Your reader has been Chris Wilhelm. Thank you for listening.